Death. It doesn't have to be the end, but for all of us, it's coming. The inescapable life statistic is that every birth certificate has an unwritten expiration date on it. We are all going to die. It is quite literally our great problem in this life. And thanks be to God that Jesus Christ claims to be the resurrection and the life. Friends, welcome to another Bible Talk in the Redeemer Queens Park community. We have a really important one on today. I really wish you would be with us right now at Salisbury Primary School where this talk is happening in person. We're celebrating baptisms today in the Redeemer community, and we look forward to bringing you some highlights and footage of what that's like later on in this next week. But for here, an abbreviated Bible talk from the very important chapter of Scripture, the Gospel of John, chapter 11, is where we are this afternoon. John chapter 11, we see Jesus dealing with our great problem of death. And we see Jesus, who is the resurrection and the life. That's the second I am statement that we're considering in this collection of talks called Jesus in His Own Words. Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. Let's get into the action right away. In John chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, we see this man named Lazarus. He was ill, and he was in the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And we learn that this illness, Jesus says, this illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So let's set the stage. You have three siblings. You have Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We've seen Mary and Martha before at a dinner party. We saw Martha running around. She's busy with the details of the night, but then we notice Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. The message that went to Jesus was from a family friend to a family friend, and the message is this: Lazarus is ill. They're asking for help on the basis of the love that they know that Jesus has for them. They're expecting Jesus to come and to heal their loved one. And Jesus had done so much more for strangers. Wouldn't He really look after those that are so close to Him? And fascinatingly, Jesus denied their request. Jesus says that this illness will not terminate in death, and Jesus sets the scene in verses 5 to 16. We learn that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And in verse 6, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was ill, He stayed for 2 more days. And you're reading, you're like, I'm sorry, hold on. He knows that Lazarus is ill, and He stays where he is for 2 days. He refuses to intervene for 2 days. And He told them plainly, his friends told Him plainly, Lazarus is dead. And Jesus says in verse 15, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. Now let's just settle into this. This is quite seemingly ridiculous. It's like Jesus, it's as if someone were to say, you know what, I love my wife so much that I forgot to get her something for Valentine's Day. I mean, are you kidding me? How much of a contradiction? But consider Jesus. Jesus' delay did not arise from indifference, and it did not arise from distance. Jesus was only a short 2 miles away. Jesus could have quickly closed the gap and got in there with His friends. And what we have here is a weighty encounter with Jesus. Jesus intentionally waits and apparently lets Lazarus die so that He may carry out a greater purpose than healing Lazarus of an illness or a disease. See, Jesus had a way of dealing with death, and His purposes are higher than ours. So let's watch. Let's watch Martha deal with death. In John chapter 11, verses 17 to 27, we see Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. And in verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It must be noticed that Jesus was moving in. Jesus did turn up. Jesus did come through. It just wasn't when they thought He would. And we see Martha hurrying out to meet Jesus. Her words are an appeal for Jesus to intervene 4 days into death. And Jesus answers her with an affirmation. It seems like they're missing each other in this encounter. In verses 17 to 27, Jesus is telling her that he is the resurrection. It's the big idea from this Bible talk today. In verse 24, Martha answered, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And in verse 26, Jesus says, whoever believes in me will never die. Jesus looks at Martha and he says, I am the resurrection. I'm the ending that everyone is headed to. Martha, whose faith knows Jesus to be a powerful intercessor, is challenged. As she is dealing with death, she has the opportunity to accept this new claim of God. She's getting there in her faith, but she's not there with it in her life. She's like the man born blind in chapter 9, verse 38. She's somewhat like Mary in verse 32. She does not offer her total worship. Her faith is not yet perfect because she has not yet seen God's glory. There's Martha, on to Mary. Verses 28 to 37, Mary deals with death. Mary hears about Jesus' arrival. She runs to Jesus, the one in whom death cannot exist. She makes no request. She simply falls at his feet and pours out her tears. Jesus responds to Mary different than he responds to Martha. And this is a lesson for how he responds to us today. Jesus had stern words for those who were affected by illness. We see this in Mark chapter 1, verse 43, chapter 9, verse 30. Jesus wept over the unrepenting heart of Jerusalem in Luke chapter 19, verse 41. And Jesus felt agony in the garden. We see this in Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 42. All are emotions that he felt as he did conflict with the prince of the world. John chapter 12, verse 31. So why did Jesus get so emotional in his conflict with death? We see different emotions from Mary. We see different emotions from Martha. But we see Jesus meeting Mary in her emotions. And we see Jesus getting emotional, not at the presence of someone who's emotional, as not as much as he is getting emotional when Jesus comes face to face with death. Why? Why did Jesus get so emotional? Well, part of the reason is that he was meeting Mary where she was, of course. Part of it was a feeling of emotion over the curse of death on the world that he created and he loved. Part of it was that he was missing his friend Lazarus, but maybe, just maybe, there's more to his emotions than this, because we need to see how Jesus deals with death. Jesus stands in Bethany, in the enemy outpost of Judea. The Jews stand around and they watch. The disciples are scared for their own lives. Martha is wanting a reason, and Mary is distraught with tears. And Jesus is face to face with death, which he came to destroy. Look at verses 38 and 44 and see how Jesus deals with death. Verse 38. Once more, deeply moved. Down in verse 40, he said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And in verse 42, that they may believe that you sent me. And in verse 43, hear him. He calls out to Lazarus, Lazarus, come out. And in verse 44, the dead man came out. His hands and his feet were wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the clothes and let him go. I need you to see it. I need you to see Jesus in John chapter 11, verses 38 and 33. Jesus was deeply moved at the face of death. This is a deeply deficient translation of what Jesus was actually experiencing. English doesn't have a word specifically for this. One scholar says the word should literally be translated as Jesus snorted. It really has the connotation of an animal snorting in anger as if he's getting ready to charge. The French theologian John Calvin says the word that you see in verse 33 and verse 38 is like a wrestler preparing for a contest with a hated foe. The violent tyranny of death with which he came to destroy is now right before his eyes. Jesus' groan was not a groan of sympathy. Jesus' groan was a preparation for battle. Because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And Jesus came to destroy death. I can't read this without imagining Muhammad Ali or Anthony Joshua getting in the ring ready to throw blows. The language is of a fighter preparing to do battle. And in verse 43, Jesus shouts at death with a loud voice. Can't you see what's going on here? There's snorting, there's yelling, there's shouting. Jesus is entering the ring with mankind's greatest enemy. And the title that he wears on himself is the resurrection and the life. And he heads to take on death headstrong and head on. Here's another interesting bit that the author points out in verse 47. The raising of Lazarus from the dead is the event that led to Jesus' own death. Jesus' battle with death begins in chapter 11 with yelling and shouting, but the battle would end 8 chapters later as Jesus dies on a cross himself. And then at the top of chapter 20 as Jesus rises from the dead. So notice this. Jesus, he went full body contact with death. He absorbed the curse of death that Lazarus, that Mary and Martha, and all people deserve. And Jesus offers to go to the place of the cross and to take on death in our place. Jesus snapped the neck of death and put death to death at the cross. This is the offer. This is what he offers as the resurrection and the life. Because friend, don't miss it. The only way that Jesus could interrupt Lazarus' funeral was to go ahead and get his own funeral kicked off and initiated. This is what it means for Jesus to be the resurrection and the life. He doesn't look at us in our place of death and leave us be. He enters into our pain. He enters into our grief. He enters into our tears. He feels with us. And then he moves from us to take death on for us. Death is a powerful curse, but Jesus is the author of life. The author of life stepped in creation and took on death himself. The depth of death and the love of Christ engaged in mortal combat, and Jesus came out victorious in the end. And this is as good as John's story gets until you go to the cross and grave of Jesus Christ. An immovable object met an irresistible force. Death met Christ, and Christ conquered death. Jesus has dealt with death. Jesus meets us as we deal with death as well in our own lives. What a friend we have in Jesus. Like the hymn says, he took our sins and our sorrows. He made them his very own. He bore our burden to Calvary, and he suffered and died alone. He feels as his own every broken heart, every shattered dream, and every sorrow that man carries around. And just as Jesus' apparent absence did not indicate that he had lost control or that he had faltered in his love, his apparent absence in your life doesn't indicate that he is far from you either. So the invitation for us is to consider this one who is the resurrection and the life, who meets a pair of mourning sisters deeply grieved at the loss of their brother. And he addresses them as the one who can literally raise the dead. Jesus goes to a cross. Jesus dies there, not for any sin of his own, but for the sin of the whole world, for my sin and for your sin. And what he offers in this glorious exchange is that if we would place our faith in him, then our great problem in this life of death doesn't have to be the greatest problem in the end. He offers to give us his life in place of our death. Thinking on this, bringing this all the way into the heart, is the only thing that can genuinely change us and transform us deeply from the inside out. It can give us a hope and a confidence that can allow us to transcend every situation that comes our way here in this life. So the question for all of us is this: whoever you are, wherever you are, and whatever you're facing, are you really going to resist him? He's the only one who can overcome your greatest problem, because the death rate does hold strong at 100%. Do you want to live forever? Do you want the fullness of life? Then come to him now. Place your faith in him today, because he is our only hope. Jesus, the true life, He deals with death by dying, absorbing our death into his and offering us his life in return. Redeemer community, this is what we celebrate today in baptism and in the years ahead.